Walt Whitman, an infamous American poet, essayist, and journalist, became one of the most influential writers in American history. Considered the father of free verse poetry, he introduced readers to many forbidden topics, and therefore was known for being controversial in his time. Walt Whitman was born on May 31st, 1819, in a place called West Hills, New York. To the second of 9 children, at age 4, Whitman moved from West Hills to Brooklyn, living in a series of different homes. He came from a family of low economic status and often referred to his childhood as generally restless and unhappy. Whitman concluded his formal education at age 11, where he then became an office boy working for 2 lawyers. He later became an apprentice and printer's devil for the weekly Long Island newspaper titled The Patriot, edited by a man named Samuel Clemens. Here, Whitman learned more about the printing press and typesetting. This job also first introduced him to libraries. The following summer, Whitman worked for another printer called Erastus Worthington in Brooklyn. His family moved back to West Hills, but he decided to stay in Brooklyn. He also took a job at the shop of Alden Spooner, editor of the leading Whig weekly newspaper, the Long Island Star. Here, Whitman became a patron of the local library. He joined a town debating society and attended theater performances and published some of his earliest poetry in a weekly newspaper called the New York Mirror. When Walt Whitman was 16, he left Brooklyn. He moved to New York City in search of becoming a composer. He struggled to find further work, partly due to a fire in the Printing and Public District, and partly due to the collapse of the economy leading up to the Panic of 1837. In May 1836, Whitman decided to rejoin his family in what they were now living in Hempstead, Long Island. Whitman taught intermittently at various schools, though he never was quite satisfied being a teacher. After his teaching attempts, Whitman went to Huntington, New York, and found his own newspaper, the Long Islander. After 10 months, he sold the publication to E.O. Crowell, and there are no known surviving copies published under Whitman. By the summer of 1839, he found a job as a typesetter in Queens with the Long Island Democrat. He shortly left that job as well, though, and attempted another teaching job in the winter of 1840 to the spring of 1841. During this time, Whitman published a series of 10 editorials called the Sundown Papers from the desk of a schoolmaster. In these essays, he adopted this constructed persona, which was a technique he would utilize throughout his career. Whitman then moved back to New York City, working a low-level job at the New World. He continued working for short periods of time at various newspapers. In 1842, he was the editor of Aurora, and from 1846 to 1848, he was the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle. While working for the latter institution, many of his publications were in the area of music criticism, and it is during this time that he became a devoted lover of the Italian opera. This new interest had an impact of his writing on free verse. He later said, "But for the opera, I could have never written Leaves of Grass." Throughout the 1840s, Whitman contributed freelance fiction and poetry to various periodicals, including Brother Jonathan magazine edited by John Neal. Whitman lost his position at the Brooklyn Eagle after advocating for the Free Soil barn burner wing of the Democratic Party against the newspaper's conservative owner, Isaac Van Anden. Whitman was a delegate to the 1848 founding convention of the Free Soil Party, which was concerned about the threat slavery would pose to free white labor and northern businessmen moving into the newly colonized western territories. In 1852, Whitman serialized a novel titled Life and Adventures of Jack Engle, an autobiography, a story of New York at the present time, in which the reader will find some familiar characteristics in 6 installments of New York Sunday Dispatch. In 1858, Whitman published a 47,000-word series called Manly Health and Training under the pen name Mose Velzor. This self-help guide recommends beards, nude sunbathing, comfortable shoes, bathing daily in cold water, eating meat almost exclusively, plenty of fresh air, and getting up early each morning. Present-day writers have called Manly Health and Training quirky, so over the top, a pseudoscientific tract, and wacky. After years of competing for the usual rewards, Walt Whitman was determined to become a poet. As early as 1850, he began writing what would become Leaves of Grass, a collection of poetry he'd continue editing and revising until his death. He intended on writing a distinctly American epic and used free verse with a cadence based on the Bible. At the end of 1855, Whitman surprised his brothers with the already printed first edition of Leaves of Grass. His brother George didn't think it was worthy of reading. Whitman paid for the publication of Leaves of Grass himself and had it printed at local shops during their breaks from commercial jobs. A total of 795 copies were printed. No name was given as the author. The title page instead was an illustration of his portrait done by Samuel Hollier. 500 lines into the body of his text, he finally gave his name, Walt Whitman, an American, one of the roughs, a cosmos, disorderly, fleshly, and sensual, no sentimentalist, no stander above men or women or apart from them, no more modest than immodest. The inaugural volume of poetry was preceded by a prose preface of 827 lines. The succeeding untitled 12 poems totaled 2,315 lines, belonging to the first untitled poem later called Songs of Myself. The first edition of Leaves of Grass was widely distributed and stirred up significant interest, in part due to Emerson's approval, but was occasionally criticized for the seemingly obscene nature of the poetry. People had called the book trashy, profane, and obscene. On July 11, 1855, a few days after Leaves of Grass was published, Whitman's father died at the age of 65. Rather than relying on symbolism, allegory, and religious or spiritual meditation, Leaves of Grass exalts the body and the material world instead. Leaves of Grass is most noticeable for its discussion of sensual pleasures during a time when such displays were considered immoral. Therefore, this piece was highly controversial during its time, and Whitman was subject to many critics. Over time, however, the collection has infiltrated popular culture and has been recognized as one of the central works of American poetry. During the first publication of Leaves of Grass, Whitman had financial difficulties and was forced to work as a journalist again, specifically with Brooklyn's Daily Times starting in May 1857. He left the job in 1859, though it's unclear whether he was fired or chose to leave. Whitman, who typically kept detailed notebooks and journals, left very little information about himself in the late 1850s. As the American Civil War was beginning, Whitman published his poem, Beat, Beat, Beat Drums, as a patriotic rally call for the North. Whitman's brother George had joined the Union Army and began sending Whitman several vividly detailed letters of the battlefront. On December 16, 1862, a listing of fallen and wounded soldiers in the New York Tribune included his brother. Whitman made his way south immediately to find his brother, though his wallet was stolen along the way. Whitman accounted for his travels and later found George alive, with only a superficial wound on his cheek. Whitman, largely impacted by seeing the wounded soldiers and piles of their amputated limbs, left for Washington on December 28, 1862, with the intention of never returning to New York. In Washington, D.C., Whitman's friend Charlie Eldridge helped him obtain part-time work in the Army Paymaster's office, leaving time for Whitman to volunteer as a nurse in the Army hospitals. He would write of this experience in The Great Army of the Sick, published in New York newspaper in 1863, and 12 years later in a book called Memoranda During the War. He then contacted Emerson, this time asking for help in obtaining a government post. Another friend passed on a letter of recommendation from Emerson to Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury, hoping he would grant Whitman a position. Chase, however, did not want to hire the author of such a disreputable book as Leaves of Grass. On September 30th, 1864, Whitman's brother George was captured by Confederates in Virginia, and another brother died of tuberculosis compounded by alcoholism on December 3rd. That month, Whitman committed his brother Jesse to the Kings County Lunatic Asylum. Whitman's finally got a better-paying government job as a low-grade clerk in the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the Department of the Interior, thanks to his friend William Douglas O'Connor, who had written to the Assistant Secretary of the Interior on Whitman's behalf. A month later, George was released from capture and granted a furlough because of his poor health. And on May 1st, Whitman received a promotion to a slightly higher clerkship and published Drum Taps. Effective June 30th, 1865, however, Whitman was fired from his job. Though several clerks who were seldom at their respective desks were fired, he may have been dismissed on the moral grounds after finding 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass. O'Connor protested until Whitman was transferred to the Attorney General's office on July 1st. Though still upset, and vindicated Whitman by publishing a biased and exaggerated biographical study, The Good Gray Poet, in January 1866. This 50-cent pamphlet defended Whitman as a wholesome patriot and established the poet's nickname and increased his popularity. Whitman then published the infamous poem, O Captain, My Captain, about the death of Abraham Lincoln, the only poem to appear in the anthologies during Whitman's lifetime. After suffering a paralytic stroke in early 1873, Whitman then moved from Washington to the home of his brother in Camden, New Jersey. His mother, having fallen ill, and also there, died the same year in May. Both events were difficult for Whitman and left him depressed. While in residence, though, he was very productive, publishing 3 more versions of Leaves of Grass, among other works. He remained at his brother's home until buying his own in 1884. His other brother, Edward, an invalid since birth, also lived in the house. As the end of 1891 approached, she prepared a final edition of Leaves of Grass, a version that has been nicknamed the Deathbed Edition. Walt Whitman had then died on March 26, 1892, from various lung issues. Whitman's influence on poetry remained strong. Mary Woodall Smith Costello argued, "You cannot really understand America without Walt Whitman, without Leaves of Grass. He has expressed the civilization up to date, as he would say, and no student of the philosophy of history can do without him." Modernist poet Ezra Pound called Whitman America's poet. He is America.